Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.
Jess, the CEO and Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. The council has a statewide mission to promote the dignity and empowerment of people who are blind and visually impaired. And I'm also very honored to be a member of the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition. Joining me today are three outstanding advocates who will help us to tell the story of the experience of people with disabilities in Wisconsin when we want to vote and how we can work together to enhance the disability vote throughout our state. So in just a few minutes after I'm finished speaking, I'll turn the microphone over to Harvey Ross with Independence First from Milwaukee. And then Steph Birmingham from Options to Community. Of the Blind and Visually Impaired of the experience of people when we want to vote and have. Thanks. I was getting significant mic feedback, so it sounds like Facebook Live is just a few seconds behind us. So after Harvey speaks this morning from Independence First in Green Bay, Steph Birmingham from Options to Community Living, in Green Bay. Harvey is with Independence First in Milwaukee. And then we'll turn to Barbara Beckert with Disability Rights Wisconsin, who will bring us home with talking about some of the work of the Disability Vote Coalition. So we see voting as just a fundamental right and a critical civic responsibility for citizens throughout the United States. Even though it's such a fundamental right, continually we see those of us with disabilities voting at lesser rates than our friends and neighbors across all demographics. And there's some significant reasons why that is so. One of them is that as people with disabilities, we face incredible barriers to voting. Things that, as we share them with our friends and neighbors and loved ones, they're astounded to know what we face as we attempt to get equal access to the ballot box. One of those significant barriers is the need for voter ID. We know from study after study that voter ID disproportionately disenfranchises certain voters, people from racially diverse and ethnically diverse communities, people in rural communities, people with disabilities, people who are elders. People with disabilities often don't drive. And so we need to figure out how to get ourselves to DMVs to obtain the proper identification to be able to vote. Sometimes there's not mass transit to those DMV centers. In rural communities, voters may have to travel to another community entirely, and they lack transportation options for getting there and maybe even very limited DMV hours. The voter ID is only one form of barrier that we face, even though we're 30 years into the Americans with Disabilities Act. Some of our polling places are still physically not accessible to all voters. There's still stairs or narrow passageways, narrow doorways, lack of elevator lifts, the things that would allow a voter to successfully get to and through the polling place to be able to cast their ballots. Others of us face situations where when we show up at the polls, the accessible voting equipment is either not there, not set up, or not functioning. And if you cannot see or read or physically mark the ballot, you are very much in need of that accessible voting equipment. Other voters have been denied the access to vote because they could not physically state their name and address. So those are just a handful of the barriers that we face in regular times. We're in pandemic times now, so the barriers that we face have just amplified very profoundly. I'm going to choose to focus on absentee balloting as a key example. So voter advocacy groups around the state and around the country are strongly advocating for the absentee ballot, including the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition, for obvious reasons. It provides physical safety and less contact with the virus to not be in a polling place. However, for some of us, myself included, Wisconsin does not have an ADA compliant voting absentee option. I receive a paper ballot in the mail, just as every Wisconsinite does, and I cannot see that ballot to be able to mark it independently and privately. I'm dependent on asking a family member to do that for me. So I sacrifice my right to that independent and private ballot and must entrust my family member to mark the ballot according to my wishes. Or I need to make the choice to risk my health and that of my family to show up at the polling place and be able to use the accessible equipment. In my case, I'm choosing to vote absentee, and I can already feel the grief and disappointment of not having control over my own ballot. I'm fortunate to trust my family implicitly, knowing that they will mark the ballot according to my wishes. I've had conversations with other blind and visually impaired voters, many of who have asked to remain confidential for their own safety, who fear that their family members will not mark the ballot in the way that they want. And so now they're faced with the tough decision of, do I vote and risk that my vote isn't cast in the way that I intend, or do I simply not vote? So this week, and actually all weeks, but this week we really want to focus on the importance of what we can all do by working together to reduce some of these barriers and encourage people with disabilities to get out to vote. And you, as members of the media, are so incredibly critical in telling our stories and helping people to understand how badly we want to vote, how much we value it, and how we can work together to reduce those barriers. When people with disabilities vote, we actually all win. So in 2018, we saw people with disabilities in Wisconsin increase our power of voting by nearly 8 percentage points. We'd love to see that increase even more going into these 2020 elections. When we vote for things that benefit the wider community, like transportation equity, healthcare equity, employment equity, and education equity. So please, let's work together to remove the barriers and to increase the disability vote in Wisconsin. We would love your questions. And so after our three other speakers, so Harvey, Steph, and Barbara, we will take questions from the media, and you can feel free to start putting those in chat whenever you wish. And then Barbara will work through the questions and pitch them to any of the three of us on the panel. Also want to let you know that this is being broadcast to Facebook Live so that members of the wider public, disability community, and our friends and allies can also have access to it. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. And Harvey, I'm delighted to pitch the microphone to you.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Harvey Ross, and I'm employed at Independence First. And when it comes to like voting and voting rights, like even when, and I can just go to what happened to me this year when the whole COVID thing and stuff broke out, and we had the vote earlier this year. I think it was, what was it, like April or May? We had the vote, and Donald Trump came on, television saying that, the virus. This is when, like, we were at the height of the virus, and they were saying people go outside. And then here in Milwaukee, or whatever, throughout the counties, like they lessened. We only had 5 voting places that you can go to vote. And then I sent in for my absentee ballot, and I never got it. So then I had to debate with myself, well, should I go out to the polls and vote and risk getting sick? And then actually, because my mother, she's older and she has a lung condition, should I go out and vote? And then even if I don't get sick, risk her getting sick. So literally, I had a choice to make, and the choice that I made was I didn't go. I never got my absentee ballot to register to vote, so I didn't go. And I'm wondering, and I say to myself, as they continue to talk about the virus and how it's supposed to be another wave that's coming soon, and what if I don't receive my absentee ballot again now? Do I go out and vote and risk my health and the people around me, their health? So it's kind of, in a way, it's almost like, and it sounds bad, but it's almost like our government is purposely doing this to stop us from voting in the big scheme of things. And that's how I look at it. And even before all this happened, I have a polling place that I go to vote that's near my house. And they say it's accessible, but it's really not accessible without assistance. And then you think about, like, November, you may have snow, rain, or whatever. So then you got to find someone to get and maneuver around to get into these voting places. And sometimes, they say they're accessible, but in the big scheme of things, a lot of them are not accessible, at least from my standpoint, the things that I have seen. Is that enough? Should I continue? That's the gist of it on my behalf.
That's awesome, Harvey. Thank you so much. Steph, I'd love to have you share your story.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Birmingham with Options for Independent Living in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So I share some similar experience to Harvey, although we live in kind of different areas of the state. So I was just going to share a little bit of my experience pre-COVID, and then now in this kind of new way of living with COVID. So a voting experience that really sticks out in my mind as very challenging but felt really important to me was a recent last year's spring election in April. For me, I was particularly interested in participating because of the mayor seat that was up for that was open, and I was really looking forward to casting my vote for a particular candidate. However, as Harvey said, and Denise commented earlier, transportation for individuals with disabilities can be a challenge. As a power wheelchair user who doesn't drive, that is very much my experience. So being April, and being that we are in Wisconsin, we have the chance that snow does continue to impede our travel. And for me, that was the case in April. I was so determined, however, that I really took the risk of having to drive my wheelchair in the streets, just because I wanted to get to my polling place, which was really no more than maybe at most half to 3/4 of a mile away, which doesn't sound far.
We are in Wisconsin.
Isn't far. However, it's far enough when you have to be driving your wheelchair down the street and hope that vehicles can see you past snowbanks. But I will tell you that once I cast that ballot, I was particularly proud of that ballot because I knew the effort and what it took for me to be able to vote. So it was really important to me. But I also recognize that it really shouldn't be that difficult for people. So because of that experience, and then really everything that has happened because of COVID, I really realized that why don't I take advantage of the opportunity to participate in absentee voting? So I was one of the lucky people, but as you heard Harvey share, and many other people throughout Wisconsin, not just individuals with disabilities, but probably your own friends and family who registered to vote, applied for an absentee ballot. They didn't get their ballot. I was fortunate I did get my ballot in the mail and was able to vote in time. Knowing that COVID is probably going to be around for a while, I have decided to continue to vote via absentee ballot. Because of COVID, I've also relocated back to my hometown where there is no public transportation available. So the reality is getting to a polling place will be extra challenging. And as a person who chooses to limit their likelihood of contracting the virus, I choose to limit my outdoor public exposure and choose not to go to a polling place. So it just seems like a really logical option to choose to vote via absentee ballot. So it's available to everyone. You don't have to necessarily just be an individual with a disability. So that's one of the great benefits of being here in Wisconsin. And recognizing that as a person with a disability, there are so many countless advocates who are way before my time, who fought fearlessly and tirelessly to ensure that individuals with disabilities have the right to vote. And while I admit that there were years I didn't vote simply because I didn't think it mattered, I wised up and recognized that I really was doing a disservice to those advocates before me by not voting and not engaging in the political process. And I feel that if I want to engage in conversation about my political leaders and the political process, then it's part of my responsibility to be a voting member of my community.
Stephanie, thank you so much. And then turning to Barbara.
Good morning, and thank you so much, Harvey and Steph, for sharing your stories. I'm Barbara Beckert with Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition, and so glad to have this opportunity to share with you today some of the barriers we're seeing and some of our recommendations to address them. I help to coordinate the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition. We are a nonpartisan effort to help ensure full participation in the entire electoral process for voters with disabilities. The coalition is coordinated by Disability Rights Wisconsin and the Board for People with Developmental Disabilities, and we have a number of organizations across the state who are active members, including those who are speaking on the call today. I want to make sure that we all understand that we're talking about a significant number of voters who are experiencing these barriers. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that 26%, 1 in 4 adults, have some type of disability. So this is a significant number of voters. In addition, disability is the only minority group that any one of us might join at any time. So we all have a vested interest in ensuring that our elections are accessible and inclusive. As Denise mentioned, this month we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act, one of America's most comprehensive pieces of civil rights legislation. And although we've made a lot of progress in expanding opportunity, accessibility, and inclusion, we've seen this year that we still have a long way to go in terms of ensuring equitable access to the ballot box. We have absentee ballots that are not ADA compliant, polling places that are not accessible, and non-drivers who cannot register to vote because they can't obtain the required photo ID. Disability Rights Wisconsin has a voter hotline. We always get some calls about barriers voters experience during our elections, but during the April and May elections, the contacts we had were unprecedented in terms of the barriers voters were experiencing. I'm going to share just a couple of them with you to give you an idea, and you've already heard of some from our speakers today. We heard from a voter with a disability in northern Wisconsin who lives in a group home. He wanted on election day to go and vote, but he was told, if you leave, you will not be able to come back. So because of the pandemic, they were not allowing voters to go and vote at their polling place, yet they provided no assistance with absentee voting. So this individual had the choice between asserting his right to vote or losing his home. So he chose not to vote, but he was very upset about it. We heard from a young woman in a nursing home. She too wanted to vote. No assistance was being provided to get her an absentee ballot. We were able to give her some guidance, but it was late and her absentee ballot did not arrive until election day. So although she completed it because of requirements for the postmark, it's likely that it wasn't completed, that her vote did not count. We heard from voters both in Green Bay and in Milwaukee who had tremendous difficulties because of the long lines to vote. This Green Bay voter said, "My husband and I are both disabled. We drove to the voting site 5 times throughout the day. The line was so long. Neither my husband or I can stand in line for 4 hours because of health issues. Therefore, we did not get a chance to vote. No curbside voting was available to give us an opportunity to vote from our car." We heard from a student with a disability who was on campus. She was the last student left in the dorm. People had left because of the pandemic. She needed a witness for an absentee ballot, but everyone else was gone. She did not know anyone and was scared to go out because of COVID. So people with disabilities continue to be at higher risk for the pandemic, and for that reason, face additional barriers. One of the strategies that we are using as a coalition is to partner with organizations that serve people with disabilities, that provide personal care, supportive home care, and other in-home services. We can't reach out to people in the way that we would like to because of the pandemic. We can't meet with them in person during National Disability Voter Registration Week and offer to assist them with registering to vote or obtaining a photo ID. But there are many organizations like Independence First and Options who may be providing direct service and are able to do so. So we welcome the opportunity to partner with them, to partner with the state aging and disability resource centers and other organizations that are working directly with individuals with disabilities. We also wanted to highlight today that as a coalition, we want to be part of the change. We have a package of policy recommendations that we are eager to advance that will provide a way for our policymakers to ensure that Wisconsinites with disabilities have more equitable access to the ballot box. Our policy recommendations prioritize a few areas that I'll touch on briefly. First of all, the absentee ballot process in Wisconsin is not ADA compliant or screen reader accessible. This is a top priority for us to advance changes to ensure that voters with disabilities who need access to assistive technology to vote privately and independently have equitable access to absentee voting. We are concerned, as you've heard, about limited access to photo ID for voting. Because so many voters with disabilities are non-drivers, they need to obtain a photo ID from voting for the DMV, which was closed during much of the year and continues to have limited hours. So we have advanced recommendations that the DMV should offer extended hours in the months leading up to the election. In addition to that, we recommend the use of satellite offices and mobile DMVs. If we had a mobile DMV offices, they could move around to areas where voters with disabilities and older adults would have greater access and be able to obtain the ID that is required by Wisconsin law in order to assert the right to vote. Another area that we are focusing on is improved access for voters who live in care facilities. That includes not only nursing homes, but group homes, adult family homes, and other settings where voters with disabilities, not only older adults, may be living. During our usual elections, special voting deputies are dispatched to provide in-person absentee voting at care facilities. Because of the pandemic and the additional risk for individuals who live in congregate facilities, special voting deputies are not being dispatched. So we have advocated for additional support to be provided to voters in those facilities by staff to assist them with absentee voting and with voter registration. And we're pleased to see that the Wisconsin Election Commission just this week has sent out information that will support care facility staff in doing so. So we encourage care facility staff to take action to ensure that voters are not disenfranchised simply because they live in a group home, adult family home, or nursing home. Again, the Disability Vote Coalition welcomes the opportunity to partner and to be a resource. So those are a few of the policy recommendations that I particularly wanted to elevate. We do have a packet that is going to be posted on our website and that I'd be happy to share with any members of the media as well. I know there was interest in knowing what some of our recommendations are that we'd like to see addressed by the election. And those, I think, are some of the most pressing. So with that, I think I will open it up to questions, and we'd welcome the opportunity for any of our panel members to address any of the questions or concerns you might want to share with us today. I'll look in the chat to see what might be in there. So we have a question from Chuck Kornbach from WUWM. And he said that this question is for any of the speakers. I've touched on it a little, but would love to hear from some of our other panel members. What are the key things that need to happen before the August election and before the November election to address the barriers that we've discussed? So Denise, I see that you're not muted, so can I kick it over to you?
Absolutely. So because, thanks for the question, Chuck. It's a great one. Because there is such a need for voters to vote absentee, we really want to see a form of accessible absentee ballot made available for those of us who cannot mark a paper ballot. So there are some powerful ways that this could be done by properly tagging and making an electronic, or actually not an electronic, but an emailed PDF available to those of us who request it. We can then be able to mark that ballot privately and independently using our own screen reader technology, print that ballot, and mail it back in the certified envelope. So if we can accomplish that for the November and August elections, that would be liberating for those of us who cannot on our own mark that absentee ballot, and would keep us safe since we wouldn't have to go into the polls. So that to me would be a high priority.
Thanks, Denise. Harvey, did you have, and Steph, would either of you like to offer a response to that question about something that would be important to have in place before the August or November elections?
One thing I probably would say is that if the poll places are truly accessible as far as getting into the polling places, that they would have adequate and sufficient help for people who may come but don't have like the ability to fill out the forms themselves if they come in person. Because usually you're left to your own vices, then you got to look around and ask people, but can you help me do this? And a lot of people probably don't understand, like, oh, help you in which way? And then you also got to think about the privacy point of it. And then with the whole thing with COVID and 6 feet of separation, wherever all that stuff needs to be like addressed when it comes to voting in August and then November.
Harvey, thank you for elevating those issues. I just wanted to mention that in terms of accessibility, Disability Rights Wisconsin usually conducts accessibility audits of polling places on election day for the Wisconsin Election Commission. And that's an important effort to get out there and to evaluate our polling places when they're being used. It's hard to do it when an election isn't taking place. And unfortunately, because of the concern with the pandemic, those audits are not taking place this year. So we encourage voters with disabilities, if they do have concerns at their polling place, we would like to hear about it, and the Election Commission would like to hear about it. They recently added an option on their complaint page, which is specifically for accessibility-related complaints. And while we made progress with our polling places, we still have a long way to go. In the last audit that I did, one of the places was a church. We opened the door to go into the church. The first thing we saw was a long flight of stairs going down to the church basement. That is where their polling place was. So needless to say, that was not accessible to voters with disabilities. Steph, it looked like you might have a comment.
I was just gonna just kind of continue to add and emphasize what Denise and Harvey have already said in terms of just really encouraging individuals to certainly register to vote if they're not already registered, to do that early, knowing that that can take some time and challenge, given what we talked about, and then also to really request that absentee ballot as soon as possible as well, to try to avoid the delay or not getting it on time. And you're able to, select that you'd like absentee ballots kind of continuously until you say that you no longer want them. And that can be a really helpful option so that a person doesn't have to remember to continue to request it for each election. So just really bring that point home.
Thank you, Steph. We have an additional question from UWM. Any pending legal action in Wisconsin or nationally that could help your coalition? So thank you for that question. There are a number of lawsuits, election-related lawsuits that have been going on this year, and I'll just speak to one that my agency, Disability Rights Wisconsin, and Black Leaders Organizing for Community, are both plaintiffs in. And this lawsuit was brought by Protect Democracy. They're also individual plaintiffs, individuals with disabilities. And that lawsuit asks for a number of different changes that would make our voting process more accessible. And one of them would be requiring Wisconsin to put in place an accessible absentee voting option so that voters with disabilities have equitable access to vote privately and independently. And there are additional recommendations as well that, for example, one area that was a significant barrier in the April election was the lack of access equitably to curbside voting. Under Wisconsin law, curbside voting is supposed to be available at polling places for voters who, for reasons of disability, have difficulty accessing their polling place. And some polling places do this very well and make it available, but often it is not available, and voters do not know that they have this right. And particularly in a lot of the rural areas of our state, we hear about challenges where the polling place is not accessible. People don't know that they have the right to curbside voting, and as a result, some people may not vote. So that's one of the opportunities going on right now. we'd love to take any additional questions that you might have, but as we wait and see if there are any other ones, one question that I might ask is if any of our panel members could speak about what their organizations might be doing to help support voters with disabilities in advance of the August and November election to help them overcome these barriers.
I can kick it off, Barbara. This is Denise. The Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired partners closely with the Disability Vote Coalition. So we use the power of our social media and our publications to help our constituency understand the importance of voting and then also about making a voting plan, because the barriers are so significant. And Stephanie's done a beautiful job of really emphasizing this point that we can't wait until close to election day to have a plan. So beginning that planning several weeks, and if not a couple months in advance. Who will be the person that can help you complete your ballot? Who will be your witness? How will you make sure that you get your ID? Because in Wisconsin, in order to get that ballot sent to you absentee, you must upload a copy of your ID onto the MyVote website. And while the myvote.wi.gov website is very accessible screen reader, the option to load the picture is very difficult for those of us who can't see. So being able to do that, or making the decision to vote indefinitely confined, which is an option for people with disabilities that's very legitimate, that all needs planning time. And so we've been encouraging people to make a plan to vote, know who your allies are, your access people are. We've been working with our on-the-ground vision services professionals, as well as the folks from the State Department of Health Services who do in-home support and vision rehabilitation with folks to encourage the clients that they see to make a voting plan.
Thank you, Denise.
And I believe, and this sounds crazy, but I should know this totally. But I believe for a fact that I know that at Independence First, we have made it safe and accessible for people to come to register vote at our site on First in Virginia, and for people in those districts or whatever. So I know that we do that personally at the place where I work at, which is Independence First.
That option, we've been sharing information on our social media, Facebook page. And any consumer that would call with any questions about voting or the process, we would certainly provide that information and then direct them to the Disability Vote Coalition website for more information if they needed more information on the process to register and what their rights are.
And I guess this is just a question, and it's not even just for people with disabilities. When it comes to the absentee ballot voting, like, how do we really know if our vote is even being counted? Do we really know that, or we're just assuming that it is and not really? Because with all the shenanigans going on in the world today, and all these, and the way Trump them are acting or whatever, then you got some governors in certain states who are, hiding ballots and all this stuff. Like, how do we really know if the whole, if the process is really working, or we just don't, and we just hoping and praying that we're doing the right thing, and we're hoping and praying that our government is doing the right thing also.
Yeah. Well, Harvey, thanks for the question. Just to speak to that, I think one positive change that has been made, and people often wonder when they vote absentee because they're not necessarily delivering it in person, how do I know if my ballot is getting there and is being counted? And one thing that is being added now for absentee ballots is a barcode. And that barcode is something that voters can use to check on the status of their absentee ballot. So I'm really gratified to see that. So I entered my absentee ballot request in MyVote Wisconsin recently. I can look on MyVote and see what is the status. Has it been sent to me yet? And then once I complete it, I can see have they received my ballot. And these postal codes or barcodes will help them to be able to track it throughout the process. And I think will help to increase confidence in the system after what happened in April. So good question. I will say that our process is way too complicated. We just created a new fact sheet to help people with absentee voting. It's 4 pages long. Mm-hmm. Why is our process so complicated? I just saw an additional question from Paul Borowski. He said, you mentioned no special voting deputies. Sounds like there is a plan and possible legislation to train staff at facilities to act as deputies had done. How will these people be trained? Is there outreach to facilities to find out who may need? How about people who live in a private home? So that's a great question. As Paul indicated, special voting deputies will not be dispatched to care facilities for the elections for the remainder of 2020. And they usually perform the process of providing in-person absentee voting at the nursing home or at the group home. And they can also assist voters with registration. So care facility staff at a facility that has special voting deputies are not allowed to assist voters usually, only the special voting deputies. So the change that has been made is because there will not be special voting deputies, care facility staff are allowed to assist voters. They don't have quite the same role as special voting deputies. And there is not a requirement for them to receive training, but it is our hope that they will be trained. The Wisconsin Election Commission has sent out some documentation to assist them with understanding the process for absentee voting and voter registration. And the Disability Vote Coalition is in discussion with both the Election Commission and GWAR, the Greater Wisconsin Aging Resource Group, to see if there are opportunities to work together to provide a training for facility staff. As far as the question also asked, how about people who live in a private home? So that is challenging because so many people are isolated right now. So we have a couple of different strategies. First of all, we have a DRW voter hotline. We are trying to widely disseminate that. It's 844-DIS-VOTE. The city of Milwaukee is sending out postcards right now to voters in the city to remind them to register to vote and to get an absentee ballot because that's the safest way to vote right now. They've included our phone number on there. We're ready and willing to provide assistance to voters with disabilities and to their allies with voter registration and absentee voting. And the other strategy that we're using is training care providers, people who provide personal care, the family care managed care organizations, mental health workers. If we can give them information about voter registration and absentee voting that they can share with the folks who they are supporting, they will have access during the pandemic that organizations like ours don't currently have because people aren't getting out and about and going to Independence First or Options or senior centers for the kinds of events that they might have. There's another question here from Chuck. What is a realistic target for increasing the number of Wisconsin voters with disabilities this year? I think that's a great question. I guess my answer would be we'd like to increase it by as many voters as possible. We don't have a specific target. I think what we saw in April is we saw a decrease in the number of voters with disabilities who participated because of the additional risk for COVID-19 and the constraints that created for people. I just wanted to maybe close with a story about a voter who I heard about recently. And the story really made me, it it was heartbreaking, but it also made me very angry just to think about the barriers people are experiencing to exercising such an important constitutional right. So I heard from this individual. He's passed away. His sister had contacted me. He said, my brother lived in Sparta, Wisconsin, and wanted to vote. He was wheelchair bound and needed a medical van or cab. I asked his social worker to get him to the DMV because he did not have a driver's license or an ID for voting. She never would help him get his ID. He had MS. His last year of his life, he was bedridden. He still wanted to vote, but wasn't able to because he did not have the required ID. So hearing that story made me very angry. First of all, that he was not able to vote or thought he could not vote because he did not have the required ID. That should not have been a barrier to such an important constitutional right. But in addition, Wisconsin does have an option called indefinitely confined, and that is for voters who have difficulty going to their polling place for reasons of disability, age, infirmity, or health condition. And those voters are able to self-certify that they are indefinitely confined and are not required to have a photo ID. So this gentleman actually could have voted, but because our law is so complex and so many people are not familiar with it, he didn't have the opportunity. So the Disability Vote Coalition is determined to ensure that voters with disabilities do not have those barriers and are able to fully participate in our electoral process. So that's our goal, and that's one reason that we're so grateful to be with you today to elevate this as part of National Disability Voter Registration Week. So thank you so much to WisconsinEye and other members of the media, and to all of our panelists for joining with us today. Looking forward to working with all of you to ensure that every voter has the opportunity to participate in the August and November elections. Thank you, and please check out the Disability Vote Coalition website, disabilityvote.org, for additional information and resources, including our policy recommendations, or follow up with me directly. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Campaign 2020 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Quick Trip, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, and Wisconsin Operating Engineers Local 139.